All right, let's talk about transaction costs. Now, this is a simple idea that is really fundamental in some really big, important areas in economics, especially in law and economics, the economic study of how the law works and how the law may or may not help us to get to efficient outcomes. Now, the big name in transaction costs is Ronald Coase, who gave us the idea. And there's two big papers he's known for: The Nature of the Firm, which we're going to talk about in just a minute, and The Problem of Social Costs, where you will hear the phrase the Coase Theorem. I'm going to start with this because, of course, there are a lot of these social cost issues all over the internet, and it's a fascinating little bit of economics. But I want to focus a little bit more on the nature of the firm end of things in this module. So let's get the Coase theorem out of the way. Is not quite the right word, but let's get it out of the way. So let's imagine that we've got, say, a factory. And let's say this factory kind of makes a lot of noise. It's sort of rumbling, and there's this little, say, dentist's office next door, doctor's office, or whatever, right? Whatever it is. In this case, what we've got is in the factory some activity where they're facing some marginal costs in order to produce something. So let's say they're making candy. They got to pay for ingredients, they got to have energy, they got to have labor. But as long as that marginal cost is less than the marginal benefit, then it makes sense to operate that candy factory. That in and of itself, no big deal. But what if they are operating this heavy machinery right next to this dentist, right? Imagine you are going to the dentist and you got someone poking around in your teeth with a sharp, pointy thing, and then there's this rumbling coming from next door. That's not going to be very pleasant. I'm not going to go back to that dentist. So this looks like we've got a spillover here. We've got some negative impact. So in this case, we've got these private costs. Right? So when economists talk about private and social, what we mean is these private costs are the costs facing the factory itself. So if you own shares in this factory, the value of your shares really depends on how much money they're bringing in compared to how much money they've got to spend to get the resources necessary to operate the business. But the social costs are those private costs plus externalities. Or we could just say plus external costs. So what are the costs of operating this factory? Well, the costs are we've got to hire, let's just say, labor, materials, and energy. You can't read my handwriting, it doesn't really matter. These are just the costs of operating the factory. But we also have these external costs. So in this case, that external cost would be, say, disruption. Disruption of running your business, of operating a dentist's office. Now, how do we deal with this? So before Coase wrote this paper in 1960, which came about after he wrote a paper on the Federal Communications Commissions, the FCC, in 1959. He starts thinking about this. Prior to this point, economists look at this through good old-fashioned supply and demand eyes. So we look at it through this lens. We say, here is supply giving us our marginal private costs. Demand is telling us about our marginal private benefit. And we expect to get to some equilibrium where the price of candy in this market is P star, and we sell Q star amount of that. But we are overlooking the total cost. So what's efficient in this market? Well, for it to be efficient, we need to account for the marginal social cost, which includes labor, energy, materials, all that stuff, but also this negative impact on the neighbors. This noise, this rumbling, any smoke coming out of it. All of these things are ways that the world is made poorer that is necessary to get this benefit from this candy. Now, what we can see here, I'm doing a really condensed version of this graph, but there are other videos here on Blackboard about this stuff in the externalities videos when we talked about spillovers. What we see is that for, let's say, the 1 millionth Wonka bar, the 1 millionth unit of a good coming out of here, bringing money into the factory, the costs, the total costs, the real costs are greater than the benefit. Right? So let's say a candy bar costs $1. What we expect is that in equilibrium, that means that the marginal benefit of that candy bar is worth $1. But if the true cost of it was $1.50, that means as a society, we are 50 cents poorer. Now, from the factory owner's perspective, it makes sense to operate to the point where they go to Q star, but that's only because they're shifting some of these costs onto their neighbor, right? These external costs need to be accounted for if we want to get to an efficient outcome. But since someone else faces those costs, the decision maker deciding how much candy do we make, I should say decision makers. The first party would be the factory, the second party would be the consumers. Right? So I go buy a candy bar, I'm happy, right? I got something I value more than the price. The factory gets more money than their cost of what they're selling. We're all good, but we have this negative externality, and so we get some dead weight loss. All right, so here's the standard view. We call this the Pigouvian view after Arthur Pigou. And Pigou's perspective is a really important perspective because for a lot of things, it really is the right way to think about things. But for this example, it is not. And Ronald Coase, in his paper, The Problem of Social Cost, goes through a lot of real case studies. He goes into legal decisions and considers them as an economist and shows that, well, we have this potential issue and solving it is not as straightforward as this, right? So how do we solve it in the Pigouvian sense? I haven't actually even finished that. We just add on a tax, right? So if we say marginal private cost plus a tax, right? So now a marginal private cost plus tax shifts the supply curve, and maybe we overshift, right? But we, in that case, get rid of this dead weight loss, and we replace it with another dead weight loss. I didn't do a great job drawing this. We should be drawing our graphs bigger. I don't know why I'm conserving paper, but whatever. This tax, it's getting rid of this overproduction, right? It gets us to a smaller quantity. It gets the price to better reflect the true cost. Now, in this case, the way I drew it, that tax was too big. Right? So let's say this was $1.50 compared to a $1 non-taxed equilibrium. And if this pushes up to $2 with the tax, we kind of overdid it. We replaced one dead weight loss from having too much with a dead weight loss from having too little. But if our tax was close to 50 cents, that's going to get us close to the efficient outcome. So maybe we don't get it exactly right, but close is better than not being there at all. So the Pigouvian approach is really, really clever, and this is why economists really like ideas like carbon taxes. It's a really good idea to tax pollution, to tax the things that we do want less of, rather than things like labor or returns on investment. We don't want to tax people for doing things that are productive. A Pigouvian tax taxes them for things that are counterproductive. All right. Let's come into the Coase Theorem. Now, the Coase Theorem is sort of an overstatement, but it's a good place to start. So the Coase Theorem says if we have two conditions being met, then we can get to an efficient outcome. We'll make up some numbers for this in just a second, and of course, I encourage you to check YouTube for a lot of other good explanations. Those two conditions, I want to put zero in scare quotes, but really just low transaction costs. Right, so here we're getting back to our big idea, zero transaction costs and clear property rights. Now, I don't really like the term property rights. I think a better term would be something like decision rights. So I'm going to use the term decision rights, but if you are looking in the economic literature, you're going to see the term property rights come up a whole lot more often. So if we have those two conditions, goes the Coase theorem, we can get to an efficient outcome without needing the government to come in and implement a tax. And I'll say also, just a really quick aside, it's a really wonderful book by David Friedman called Law's Order. If any of you are thinking going to law school, you should get this book. And in Law's Order, he really fleshes out this idea of externalities and the Coase theorem and how to efficiently resolve this potential conflict that we're getting here between the factory owner on the one hand and their neighbors on the other. So this is going to be easier to understand if we make up some numbers. So we've got this problem. Let's say this external cost is, let's say it's just something equivalent to $1 million, right? So the result of this factory running is that it costs the neighbors $1 million. So maybe this piece of real estate is no longer suitable for using as a dentist's office. The landlord has to rent it to someone else. They get less income as a result. And the net present value is $1 million. That net present value thing, don't worry too much about that, but let's just bear in mind that the numbers I'm drawing here are going to be all equivalent. So you could think of this as, say, $1 million a year or $1,000 a year, whatever, right? But we're going to think some cost, and we're going to compare it to other ways of potentially dealing with this externality. So the Pigouvian tax has a really nice feature, which is we might be tempted to tell this factory, all right, you're creating some problem, so you need to, say, raise your factory and put it on a rubber foundation, something that's going to dampen this vibration and reduce this negative externality. Right? That might be something that we want to do. There might be something like some new technology in the factory to reduce this vibration and reduce this externality. And one really important outcome of thinking about the Pigouvian approach is that if we just say we're going to tax you $1 million for operating this factory, the factory is going to go for whichever of its available options is most efficient. It's going to look for the least resource-intensive way to avoid that tax, right? Or maybe there isn't a good way to avoid that tax, so they just pay the tax. So taxing bad outcomes is much better than requiring specific behavior, because maybe we require this weird rubber foundation, but maybe it costs $5 million. So if we had that outcome where this cost $5 million, sorry, let me respond to that later. If we had this $5 million approach, we would be wasting $4 million as a society. That would be inefficient. Maybe there's some other technology. Maybe that technology costs $2 million. Well, that's better. And if that approach is available, then we're going to prefer that to this, right? But we're going to have some solution. So whatever that approach is, let's just say it costs X million dollars. So the Pigouvian approach is basically going to be as long as X is less than 1, then the firm is going to do that, and we're going to get rid of the externality. Otherwise, they're going to pay the tax. And if they pay the tax, the dentist is still out of luck. Again, I'd say check out Law's Order for delving into all these details, but here's a real short version. The big thing that Coase pointed out is that this dentist isn't a victim without agency. They have things that they can do also. So there's something the dentist can do, and let's say that costs Y million dollars. So if Y is less than X and less than 1, then what we really want, what the efficient outcome is in that case, is to do whatever this is. Right? So let's just make up numbers. Let's say X equals 0.75, Y equals 0.5. The efficient resolution to this problem is to find a way to get the neighbor to do something about the problem. A classic example of this is a couple from the city moves out to the country. They find they live next to a pig farm. There's a lot of noise and pollution and stink. Who should do something? Well, the Pigouvian approach says these people are creating a negative externality. The Coasean approach says these people shouldn't have moved next to a pig farm to begin with. Right? So maybe the dentist moves. Maybe the dentist puts their building on rubber foundation. Whatever. I don't know if there's such a thing, but whatever it is that they do, they find something, and if they have a way to deal with the problem that's cheaper than the alternatives, that's what we want. So if we have low transaction costs, what that means is that the factory owner and the dentist can get together and they can come up with some sort of a deal. If we have clear decision rights, what that means is maybe the factory, maybe they go to court and the judge says the factory is going to be allowed to keep running their business as before, or the pig farm gets to keep operating. Or maybe they find in favor of the neighbor and they say, you got to do something about this. So if you go to your lawyer and the lawyer says, yeah, you're definitely going to win this case, that means clear property rights. They say you're definitely going to lose this case, that means clear property rights. So we got a different color to stand out here. Let's say we start with the right goes to the factory. So if the factory has this clear property right, the dentist goes to the factory and says, can we do something? And the factory owner says, I talked to my lawyers. They say we don't really have to do anything. The dentist at that point says, okay, well, we'll do something, right? And then they suffer $500,000 loss instead of $1 million loss, right? We get an efficient outcome. Now, what if we move the property right over here? In that case, the factory owner knows that they would lose a lawsuit, so they say, rather than pay you $1 million damage, how about we pay you $600,000 to undertake that solution? So in either case, no matter who has the property right, when it's cheapest for the dentist to do something, the dentist does something. Now, let's change these numbers. Let's make Y a little bit bigger. And now we'll say that the dentist still has that property right. But what happens? They go to the factory owner. They say, hey, look, you're doing $1 million of damage. What can you do? The factory owner says, well, we'll undertake Project X. We'd rather lose $750,000 than a full million. Or if we flip the property right, it's still efficient to do whatever Project X is, but the factory owner at this point, the dentist goes and they sue. They say, please do Project X. The factory owner says, well, we don't have to. But with low transaction costs, the dentist says, I'll tell you what, we'll pay you $800,000 to do this project for us. They write up a contract, and then instead of suffering $1 million loss, they suffer a smaller amount of loss. In other words, when we have low transaction costs and clear decision rights, when it's clear who has the right to make the decision about how noisy the neighborhood is, how polluted the air is, when it's clear who has the rights, and when we can come up with a deal that's going to be enforceable and relatively easy to come up with, we can get to whatever the efficient outcome is. All right, so that's Coase theorem in a nutshell. How important is that to know for this class? Not super, super important, but it is a really excellent use of the notion of transaction costs, and it's a great warm-up for what we're going to talk about next.